Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we have the case of Johnny Gosch. This one is actually quite well known. It's a case I've been trying to avoid for a long time because honestly, I don't like these topics, but it's a very interesting case and full of information. This case has absolutely everything. And it's likely that in these 40 minutes that the video lasts, I won't be able to include everything I really want to. There are topics here that should have their own video, so just imagine how hard it would be to include all of that right here now. Therefore, in the description, I'm leaving you the page about Johnny's case, that is the page his family made. So you can start there. Since it has a lot of information, it includes parts of the main theory and also things you can download. I especially recommend it. A document written by Johnny's mother, where she explains her point of view from beginning to end in 92 pages. It's very interesting. I won't say more as we're behind schedule. But think about it. It's a case that really changed many people's perspectives regarding what happens in cases of missing children and how people handle their safety. So with nothing more to say, on the screen, you can see the rest of my cases. Below, you'll find my social media if you'd like to follow me on any of them. So without further ado, let's begin. Johnny David Gosch was a boy at that time, only 12 years old, who lived in West Des Moines, Iowa in the United States, together with his parents and his two siblings. His life was like that of any normal child, with the difference that in the small town where he lived, he was one of the youngsters who delivered newspapers. It's likely that this doesn't happen anymore, or that there are still some small places where it does, but years ago, there were youngsters who would get up in the mornings to do this. They went with small carts, leaving them door to door. The paper boys or the kids who delivered newspapers on weekends were usually accompanied by someone. Sometimes they did it with their siblings, maybe with another friend, or most of the time with their parents. Johnny, like others, would go on weekends with his father. His parents, John and Noreen Gosch, met in Iowa. Noreen had 2 children from a previous marriage that was marked by many tragedies. Her previous husband had been diagnosed with cancer, and 2 months before succumbing to this illness, a tragedy occurred. Her house was destroyed by a tornado, along with her car and everything around it. Noreen almost lost her 2 children that day. In fact, as she tells it, the story is incredible. She says that once she found them, they were lying face down on the ground and she feared the worst. They were lying on glass. Also, she didn't dare get close until it finally rained, and then the kids started to cry. That's when she realized they were alive, finally breathing a sigh of relief. As you can see, it was quite difficult, and as mentioned earlier, her husband passed away 2 months later. Her children wondered why their father died and if the same would happen to her. It made Noreen change the way she saw things. It made her prefer to take action rather than stay crying. And this needs to be explained in order to see the context of how the case happened and to understand the feeling of helplessness that she had. She was someone who would really do anything for her children, who wouldn't just stand still, but would do everything to seek justice. With this new perspective and her life starting over, she meets, thanks to a friend, a man named John Gosch, whom she later marries. And they finally have another son named Johnny. The youngest of the 3, Johnny was a very happy child. He grew up with his siblings, with his parents. He had a pretty normal life, you could say. As I mentioned, he worked as a newspaper delivery boy on weekends. One of the most well-known photos of the case is from his first time going out to deliver. At that time, he had a backpack, but afterwards, he began using his red cart with his name on it. He also used to tie his dachshund dog there, so it could accompany him during all those mornings. An interesting fact about his life is that he wanted to buy the motorcycle shown here. And that's exactly why he started delivering newspapers, and yes, he made it. He bought the motorcycle and used to go for rides with his brother in the fields near the town. With all that said, let's move on to the day of the events. This happened on September 5th, 1982. It was almost 6 in the morning, the sun was about to rise, and Johnny was already awake to go deliver the newspapers. That Sunday, he goes out to deliver without his father. That's something I'll explain later, but he goes out alone. For some reason, his parents stayed at home still asleep without checking if he left. And it was only a few hours later, when people started calling their house, that they realized something was wrong. It turns out that in the morning, when the sun came up, the neighbors started calling the house, saying that their newspapers weren't there, that nobody had delivered them. Johnny's mother, Noreen, starts to think it was a mistake and that her son was probably still sleeping, so she got ready to scold him. She goes up to the room and sees that Johnny wasn't there, outside. Then, his father started looking for him and realized that his little cart was near the house, with the dog, but without Johnny. That's when Noreen realizes that something was completely wrong and calls the police. And this is where the whole issue of the case begins. The corruption, the lack of attention, something we'll see later on. The police station was only 10 blocks away from Johnny's house. 10 blocks in a town with few traffic lights, in a place where the police can get there in 5 minutes, 3 minutes, I think you can get there quickly. A police car arrived 45 minutes after the call. A patrol car 45 minutes later. So, an officer asked the family if Johnny had ever run away before. The family, clearly insulted by that question, answers no. That Johnny had never left, that he had no plans to leave, and that it didn't seem like he had decided to leave on his own. He was delivering the newspapers like every weekend morning. Fortunately, that same morning there was another adult on the streets watching over the kids. He was Mr. John Rossi. He saw that morning a car and inside a driver talking to Johnny Gosch. From this point, we begin to see that the story revolves around this encounter. Barely. The car saw this only adult on the street. She stopped talking to Johnny, left, made a U-turn, and disappeared from the area. The man found it strange that she was leaving abruptly. That's precisely why he remained on the corner, observing the whole situation. For that, from 6 a.m. There were several people awake who could more or less recount what they saw that morning or what they heard. Let's say that at 5:45 a.m., Johnny was on the street because a neighbor heard the cart. And here on the screen, I'm going to show you the route he took that morning, based on all the witnesses who heard or saw him. First, there's another boy named Mike on the corner opposite Johnny. He was also delivering newspapers when he saw the car stop. He saw them talking for a while. And thanks to these two people, who were able to see more or less inside the car, a composite sketch of the driver could be made. Thanks to Mike and the neighbor Rossi. This vehicle was described as a 2-door car on its side and was supposedly a Ford Fairmont. A curious detail about all this, which I only understood when I looked up the model on Google, is that many police cars from that time were actually Ford Fairmonts. And it's good to keep this in mind since there are well-founded theories suggesting that the police had something to do with this case. Or at least they knew something about what was going on, it's just a detail. John Rossi was with Mike and Johnny at that moment. He already sensed that something was off. The man in the car, the driver, seemed angry, drunk, maybe just too nervous. Definitely, something was wrong with him. After the car leaves, Johnny, Mike, and the man gather at the corner, and that's when the car shows up again. As you can see, this place has several small woods between the streets. John Rossi says that while Johnny was heading back home, a tall man came out from one of these woods. He emerged from the trees and followed him. Right then, 2 more boys were out delivering newspapers. As you can see, they cross paths with Johnny on the other side, greet each other from a distance, and go their separate ways. And that's when Johnny turns the corner and disappears. On that corner, inside a house, a young man manages to hear a very strange noise for that hour from his room. This young man hears the sound of a door closing and looks out the window to see a black and silver Ford Fairmont speeding down the street, not even stopping at the stop sign. It is then, once the car leaves, that the kids who were delivering newspapers and were near Johnny return to that corner and only see the red cart. There were a total of 5 witnesses who said that Johnny had been kidnapped, claiming that there were 2 cars and that they were different colors. However, the police did not want to create, for some reason, the kidnapping theory, a theory that actually wasn't a theory, but rather were facts. They preferred to say that he ran away. And that's why it's one of the most well-known cases of negligence so far, because it's extremely remarkable. It's very obvious that these people didn't want to find Johnny and that they didn't want to do their job. At that time, the law that says minors don't need any minimum time to be searched for didn't exist yet. So the police could simply say they didn't want to look for him, and that was it. This attitude from the police, whether they were involved or just didn't care about their job, made the case very damaged because in fact they had every opportunity to start an investigation and simply didn't do it. In the following days, all the neighbors in the village were focused on finding Johnny, alive or dead, while the police did nothing directly. And they even told people to stop searching because it was just a simple case of Johnny running away from home. However, the neighbors didn't listen and kept searching along the roads, in lakes, in ditches, anywhere he could be. What I also find curious is that the police were actually trying not to do anything related to Johnny, saying that it was a case where he had left his home on his own. It implies anyway that he was 12 years old, that he was a minor, and therefore it was also part of the police's job to take him back home again. So in the end, they had to do their job. What breaks your heart also in this case is the number of people looking for him. All this while, the family was waiting for someone to tell them something, for someone to confirm maybe whose car it was, for someone to have a clue to tell them where their son was.
We're waiting for you to come home. We're doing everything in our power to get you back, and we're leaving the porch light on every night.
In the middle of all this, a man appeared who called himself a psychic. And he told them that Johnny was dead and that he was less than 2 meters from the house, so they decided to search as well, just to rule out any possibility. But as you can already imagine, Johnny wasn't anywhere, neither near nor far from his house. By this time, it was very likely that Johnny was in a completely different place, very, very far from his home. On another note, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was never contacted by the police from this place, since according to them, there was no crime to investigate. Fortunately, there was a lot of support for the family, and they even managed to raise more than $30,000 as a reward. For anyone who knew anything about Johnny, or even for the person who brought him back, or in case they asked for a ransom,
please contact us if you have our son. We'll cooperate to bring him home safely.
As I mentioned earlier, Noreen was exhausted from the constant misfortunes in her life. She was resolute in her quest to locate her missing son. As I mentioned, she had stopped crying by then. So in the press, she never appeared sad, but rather she was firm, which brought her criticism. However, this attitude also gained her many followers and people eager to listen and help her. But precisely on the police side, on the investigators' side, they wanted to give up on the case. They had no choice but to work, as they couldn't opt out of it. They managed to postpone it, but eventually had to begin the investigation. Therefore, there were several investigators who wanted to reject the case and resign outright. Because they felt that Noreen was too much pressure, they felt that she demanded too much from them, but let's remember that they weren't doing much. Once the case reached the Federal Bureau of Investigation through the people and not through the local police, there were some representatives who referred to Noreen as a somewhat crazy person. It seems that at that time, there was a group of people who couldn't tolerate being required to do their job. Apparently, the family couldn't ask where their son was without being criticized by the authorities. In fact, as an excuse, they told the family that unless they could prove Johnny was in danger, they wouldn't look for him themselves. Going back to the work part, actually proving that he was in danger was the job of the police and at that time the Federal Bureau of Investigation. After a few months of having to deal with all this, it became known that the chief of police in the neighborhood where Johnny disappeared was corrupt. But not only that, he had also been doing favors for his family with fines and other things. He drank during work hours, which obviously affected his performance and also interfered with the investigation of one of his sons. This person obviously could not work anymore. So 6 months after these accusations, Cooney, the chief of police, resigns. The investigation then began to focus on pedophilia, when Kenneth Wooden, an expert in children's rights and safety, entered the Walsh's lives. He began to inform them about how those who kidnapped minors to sell or use them operated. And he began to talk about something that at that time was not spoken about out loud, something people didn't want to hear: At that time, as you can imagine, many parents left their children alone. They let them go out, they let them go to school without any problem, without them. And they understood that there was danger around them, but it wasn't serious enough to watch over them too much. You can imagine that this was a time when people let their children go down the street alone at night without any problem. They were a little more careful about that, but they really weren't aware of how dangerous it was for children. It's an aspect that's often overlooked in media coverage and documentaries, including the main documentary and news reports on the subject. What I'm about to tell you is told from Noreen's perspective in the document I mentioned at the beginning. That's why I stress the importance of watching it if you're interested. She says the case actually starts 2 days prior to the disappearance. At first, nothing seemed too strange to her until finally her son disappeared and the police seemed to be involved. September 3rd, 1982. Johnny's family was at a high school football game. Noreen's oldest son was playing, so they had gone to watch him. At one point, Johnny got up and went downstairs to buy popcorn, while his parents stayed in their seats. For a while, Johnny disappeared. He wasn't there. He hadn't come back. He took too long to buy something, so John, his father, went to look for him. When he found him, he was downstairs next to the shops but talking to a police officer. When he found him, obviously, he took him back to the seating area. He never had the chance to ask Johnny what he was talking about with the police officer, but at that moment on the way back, nothing seemed too strange. For the rest of the game, since Johnny didn't want to sit with his family, they let him stay down by the fence, that is, in front of the game, so that his parents could see him directly whenever they wanted. So they felt reassured that Johnny was there, down below in sight, and they relaxed a little. A few minutes later, when they looked again, Johnny was gone. Again, John went down to look for him, and when he found him, he was with a police officer. Again, under the bleachers. That is, in a somewhat dark, somewhat hidden place. She noticed something odd. She took him out again, brought him to the bleachers, and they remained there for the rest of the game. As they left, Johnny pointed at the police officer and told his family he wanted to be one when he grew up. And also that this one in particular had been very kind. They left the subject there because there was no precedent for this, and on Saturday everything seemed normal. They had dinner. Johnny was happy. Honestly, there was nothing strange except when Johnny was about to go to bed. He asked Noreen if he could deliver the newspapers alone the next day. Something that hadn't happened before, but it's somewhat understandable from the perspective of a teenager or a preteen. However, Noreen wasn't comfortable, so she told him he could only go with his father. The father nearly let him go alone, but ultimately decided it was better for him to be accompanied for some reason. Johnny went out alone the next day. His father didn't go with him. I have no idea why, because actually his father had said he would go with him, and Johnny left at the usual time. There was no chance that he suddenly forgot, and it seems way too convenient to me at the same time. Another thing that Noreen says in the document is the following. Before going to bed, Johnny comes down again to tell his mother that he loved her very much and that she was the best. He had no explanation. Perhaps he simply wanted to do it. But all of this is very casual, considering it was just hours before he disappeared. Besides all that, a neighbor from the neighborhood claims to have seen a man 2 weeks before the incident taking pictures of Johnny on his way home from school. The man who was taking pictures had a car, so the person who saw him gave his license plate number, the number that was clearly visible on that car. And the police dismissed it because supposedly taking pictures is not illegal. So they threw away the license plate number, they threw away the report, they didn't keep it, and 2 weeks later, Johnny disappeared. They also informed Rin that on the day of the disappearance. In the early morning, around 1:30, she wakes up along with her husband because of the sound of the phone. When her husband answers the call, he says, "Yes, it's fine. Yes, it's fine. It's fine," and hangs up. She asked him who it was, naturally. He answered her, and her husband said it was a wrong number, that someone had called the house by mistake. However, these calls had been happening for 4 weeks. Until the day of the incident, and never before. According to her, her husband had answered calls where the other person hung up immediately, suggesting they were wrong numbers or something else. Maybe someone playing a prank. However, after the incident happened, this seems a bit strange. In 1984, another boy who delivered newspapers disappeared. This was Eugene Martin, also in Des Moines, the place where Johnny disappeared. At that time, he was a 13-year-old boy. His face started to appear along with Johnny's in newspapers, with his full description: dark brown eyes and hair, skinny, along with what he was wearing that morning. This definitely couldn't be a coincidence. The same thing had happened. He disappeared while delivering newspapers on his usual route. Ultimately, the only lead to investigate this case was a man who had been seen talking to Eugene that very morning. The incredible thing is that the investigators in this case said there were absolutely no connections between the two young men. They didn't even pay attention to the similarities. But this brought Johnny's story back to the media. Many coincidences between the two were widely considered. The practice of putting images on milk cartons originated from these cases. You're likely familiar with this concept. Photos of them with brief descriptions. A local newspaper initiated the idea of placing them there due to their frequent usage by people. However, in these stories, it didn't bring any possibility of finding them. To this day, no one has found these two boys. In 1985, something came up that, if true, could have been a big clue. Actually, to this day, it still isn't known. This was a $1 bill that had ended up in the hands of someone who knew Johnny's story and had sent it to the police. This bill said, "I'm alive, Johnny Gosch." That is, someone, supposedly Johnny Gosch, wrote on the bill that indeed he was alive. Which could have been very important if it were true. The thing is, it was never proven to be so. And the story repeated itself once again. In '86, a 14-year-old boy named Mark Allen disappeared in Des Moines, again the same place where Johnny disappeared. Mark was last seen in Des Moines, Iowa on March 29, 1986. He lived with his mother and two brothers in Southeast Emma Avenue. On the day he disappeared, he told his mother he was going to a friend's house that was just a block away. He might watch a movie with him. Lastly, he asked his mother to save him some pizza as he would be hungry when he returned. Mark's mother didn't realize he was missing until the next day, thinking he might have stayed over at his friend's house. When she realized her son wasn't at that house, she started calling everyone, but she never found him. No one knew where he was. Initially, just like in the other case, the police said he had run away, that he had chosen to leave, and that obviously nothing else had happened to him. The police only began investigating alternative theories about his fate sometime later, because it turned out they didn't find anything indicating that he wanted to leave his home. He was never found again. The only connections found between the three boys were their similar ages and the fact that their stories were more or less the same. In this neighborhood, they suddenly disappear, mainly after a car passes through the area. What I'm getting at is that it was too much of a coincidence for these things to happen in so few years. Someone was making the kids disappear in this place. One of the most important pieces of evidence in Johnny's case came 9 years after his disappearance from Paul Bonassi, a former convict who had decided to confess something very important. He said that he helped to catch kids and that one of them had been Johnny himself. Paul's story was also quite tragic. He had been abused since he was 6 years old, and because of this, he had developed several traumas. And with that, he also developed a multiple personality disorder, which often happens as a defense mechanism for a person when something tragic happens to them that they can't defend themselves from. Or is that the short story of how a multiple personality appears? Because of what happened. Also, he became a sexual offender, which is why he had to be in prison for several years. According to him, it was through one of these multiple personalities that he discovered what happened to Johnny and that he had been there. Because really, he didn't remember much of his life. It was the other personalities who did. He recalled attacking the victim from behind and using chloroform to subdue him, though the reason for the abduction was not provided. Finally, he had a clear answer, and it was that they were going to use Johnny to produce child pornography. This man was able to make a map of the street at the exact place where the crime happened. He told who were the ones planning these things, and they were even able to make a sketch of the person who specifically planned this kidnapping. He said that he was one of those who abused Johnny, partly forced as well, and he named some other people involved in all of this. He also said that they took photos so they could sell him. Did he tell Johnny's mother details that only he could know, or people close to his family? Like that Johnny used to accompany his mother to yoga classes. Something that really no one outside the family knew or had any reason to know because it wasn't relevant. So they never mentioned it in the news. And she also mentioned several marks she had on her body, among them one on her chest, which, like this, had been mentioned in the media. A wound on his tongue that he got when he was little, a burn on his leg. And she also talked about his personality, how he acted when he was nervous or angry, something that his mother recognized perfectly. She is quite sure that this man is telling the truth to this day. It's clear from the interview footage that you can see him quite well in that moment. Disturbed, you can see him very upset. At that moment, he still hadn't received enough help, so he looked pretty bad. However, he is still alive. He constantly speaks about this case and his experiences, and it's evident in his voice, in the way he narrates, and in the confidence he displays that he's being truthful. He clearly knew Johnny and was aware of many details that hadn't been revealed in the media at that time. It was expected that the investigation would continue in this direction. It was expected that the investigators on the case would see this as a great possibility. However, instead of asking Paul directly, they went to the family 10 years after the crime and asked them if they knew where Paul was at that time. Some family members placed him somewhere else at the time of the events, and they decided to believe that. Memories from people about an event that occurred a decade ago, rather than directly asking Paul for additional information. Back again, this could be incompetence or simply not wanting the case to be investigated. On the other hand, also talking about all this, about the people involved, about the institutions involved, can we say that it was established on the internet that Bonassi could be a victim of Project Monarch? For those who don't know what we're talking about, first you have to get into the topic of Project MKUltra, if you don't know what it is. Check out the video I linked in the I button above. The problem with Project MKUltra is that it's real. It's something that happened, it's something that was later banned, but the goal was to experiment on people's minds. There are victims who kept talking for years about what they had to go through. So is Project Monarch supposed to be a continuation of MKUltra? And honestly, seeing that all of this is real, well, child trafficking rings are real. That there is a lot of complicity from people in power, from people who are part of things like the Federal Bureau of Investigation or the CIA. I find it a bit believable because it wouldn't surprise me if they wanted to continue with those projects and in the process caused some problems for a few people. This could even involve Johnny in the last theory we're going to look at in this case at the end of the video. If you're interested, I can create a video dedicated to Paul Bonassi, discussing the conspiracies and events surrounding him. You can also watch one of this person's most famous interviews on YouTube, talking about all these things at the moment when he was most vulnerable, could you say. In addition to all this, for quite some time, Bonassi had a series of letters kept that talked precisely about everything that was happening to him, and that probably happened to Johnny as well. He talked about the groups, specifically pedophile groups, and he talked about former members of all these circles. On top of all this, Paul kept letters that had been sent to him by former members of these circles, specifically from the Franklin Ring, of which he had been a participant. The only thing I'm going to say right now is that there was mention in the letters of a person with the initials Johnny Gosch Bonassi, and he said this referred to Johnny Gosch. I'll mention the final details of all that when I get to the theories. So let's move on to the last part of this video. In 1992, by some people interested from the show America's Most Wanted, they tried to find out the truth about what Paul Bonassi was saying. They tried to listen to him once more. They tried to verify what he was saying, since he had so many stories to tell. One of them was precisely about a place where children were taken to do terrible things or to be sold. It was a house in the middle of nowhere in California. So this show, which had a large audience and a lot of resources, decided to take him to the place he described, and in fact, it existed. Not only that, but he was also able to describe things that were in the house. Very specific things, for example. Downstairs, there was a well, and inside, there were initials of other boys' names, like signatures on a wall. The whole house actually was pure evidence. In fact, one would say it could be used to have a solid case about what happened to Paul. However, there was nothing concrete. While he had names, apparently they weren't enough. He had letters that talked about these topics, and apparently that wasn't enough either. Enough. He seemed to have a whole story to tell, despite lacking concrete details. And this made it so that at that moment, no one could do anything for him. So for a while, this was dismissed again. After fighting a lot for this case, Paul was finally able to take it to trial. And of course, Johnny Gosch's mother was there and had to testify. And this is where one of the most controversial parts of this whole case comes in. According to what Noreen says, the judge brought her to the stand and asked her if she had ever seen her son during the time he had been missing. At first, she didn't answer, but the judge reminded her she was under oath and couldn't lie, or there would be consequences. So she confessed that she had seen him, that Johnny had come to her house again and had asked her not to say anything for his safety. Noreen begins to tell in court that one afternoon in 1997, a man started knocking on her door. He was quite young. He knocked insistently, so she opened the door to find him standing there with an unidentified person. When she first saw him, she didn't recognize him until she saw his eyes and realized it was Johnny. She asked him, "Who are you?" And he said to her, "Mom, it's Johnny." The conversation they had inside the house lasted an hour or an hour and a half. He had to leave quickly, but during that time, he told her a big part of what had happened to him. She herself says that he probably didn't tell her all the details because while talking to her, to his mother, maybe he felt a bit of sadness. Or maybe he just didn't want to talk about it because it involved many things that probably wouldn't be good at all. He started telling her all about this child trafficking. How did it work? He also told her something that's very important to understand where the case is now. And it's that most of these kids were made to do illegal things so that they couldn't go to the police afterwards. Because if they went to the police, they would have to confess everything they did and they would also go to prison. Noreen tried to call for help. She tried to call family members, people she trusted, but Johnny and the young man who was with him got really angry. Besides this, it's also worth mentioning that while he was telling the story, he would look over from time to time as if seeking approval from the person who was with him. He told Noreen that she couldn't reveal that he had been there because they could go after him, because in fact they were already after him, and he was trying to protect his life. For 2 years, she kept this information to herself precisely to protect her son. There are people who don't believe her, and there are people who do believe her. But what's important to recognize here is that she said this during a trial, and not, for example, in the news or on television. Later, she went on television to clarify all of this, but by then it had already been news everywhere. Once she left the trial, everyone already knew about it. Finally, in 2006, Noreen received some photos of boys tied up with their mouths covered. I won't show the images because they're inappropriate. While not extremely graphic, they depict minors who are restrained. Honestly, I don't want to see it again, and I guess many others feel the same, but it's easy to imagine. There were 3 kids tied up on a bed, and then there were several photos of a boy tied up and gagged. According to Noreen, the photo of the individual boy, that is the boy who was separated from the others, was her son. He looked quite a lot like him, and here I think I can show the photo of the boy's face so you can see more or less what I mean. They do look alike, certainly, they share some features, but it was never possible to prove that it was definitely him. What the police did was look for the boys, specifically these ones in the photos, to find out what was going on, and it turns out that supposedly they found them. According to the investigators, officially it can be said that these boys were simply playing at escaping from restraints. Why did they take different photos lying on the bed? I don't understand the reason. But supposedly they were just playing, they were identified and nothing happened. The last boy, resembling Johnny and appearing alone in the photos, was never found. And if it's true that they were just tied up playing, then why wasn't he identified? Because he could easily be a friend of these boys. It's a little strange, how did they come to that conclusion? But anyway, that'll be a topic for another day, in some update, if there is one. Honestly, considering everything we've talked about earlier in this video, the first 2 theories I have to tell you about are a bit disrespectful, but they're out there are people who believe them, and I have to mention them just because of that. The 2 theories I'm talking about are that Johnny ran away from home of his own free will, leaving his dog tied up. Or that he was kidnapped by an unknown person, which would be in part true, right? it's definitely someone he didn't know. But let's say it has nothing to do with the rest of the things we saw. In other words, he was kidnapped not by a child trafficking ring member, but by someone intending to abuse him, with no kind of conspiracy behind it. Now, why do I say this is disrespectful? Well, because there were 2 cars, first of all, at the scene. Several people were involved. And there are people within the Federal Bureau of Investigation as well as within the police in those places who were clearly involved. It's not even a theory, it's not a conspiracy, it's just completely obvious. Many people resigned, wanted to resign, or were fired from their jobs. And the Federal Bureau of Investigation was hiding exactly this mistake that had been made in the institution's security. What I mean is that probably the entire Federal Bureau of Investigation as a whole has nothing to do with the case. But rather, a group of people at the time knew how to use the resources within the Federal Bureau of Investigation to be able to do things like this. That probably people who worked there were involved with pedophile rings, with corruption, and with so many other things. And right now, the Federal Bureau of Investigation wants to hide that for the sake of its reputation. So, let's look at the third theory, which would be the Franklin Circle, which is actually a pedophile ring. Paul Bonassi proposed this theory, noting the ring's connection, with exactly the case of Johnny and so many others we've talked about in this same video. This ring specifically was located in Omaha, which is close to where Johnny and the other boys were. And to talk about all of this, we have to mention the letters he kept, the letters from former members that mentioned a few things. In these, a certain Emilio was mentioned, someone named El Col, and they alluded to the kidnappings. The ones we talked about, the Eugene Martin and Mark Allen, as well as exactly what I told you before, a boy named Johnny Gosch. But this gets even stranger, supposedly because Cole, the person they referred to by that name, was actually the colonel, or rather a man named Michael Aquino. He was an officer in the United States Army, specialized in psychological warfare. He served as a lieutenant colonel in military intelligence. And also, he was known as a Satanist, a satanic priest, and the founder and leader of the Temple of Set. His wife, Lilith Sinclair, also apparently was a leader of this satanic cult. He is also mentioned as a follower of Anton LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan. Here's my problem, which is why I wanted to leave this information for the end. It could be that the colonel did have a church and a cult where things were done against minors. But it's unrelated to Anton LaVey. And precisely, the confusion can lead to even more problems when we talk about other cases or go deeper into this kind of issues. Anton LaVey wrote the Satanic Bible, which actually speaks out against pedophilia. The Bible does not specifically focus on pedophilia in the Catholic Church. It is mentioned but not portrayed as something good. And we can even see in one of his commandments that it says, "Do not harm little children." Although, of course, it's not the first time a Bible has been misinterpreted, but this is one of the things that Bonassi mentioned. And precisely, if we were able to identify a person like the colonel, the rest of the people mentioned in the letters should have been investigated and should continue to be investigated. But as I said, at the time there was nothing concrete to go against these people. Fortunately, he was still seen as a witness in all these cases. Is it until now that he keeps talking about what happened to him, about Johnny? And all of this is to help dismantle human trafficking and child trafficking. See for yourselves the person Paul Bonassi became.
Johnny truly believes that the reason they don't want him coming out is because he knows too much information, which is why he believes that if he ever comes out, he'd be killed immediately, or he would disappear.
One of the most involved in all of this was Larry King. Paul accused him of being the one who caused him all these traumas and the one who brought him into this circle. At first, Larry was not convicted under any charges. For a long time, he wasn't considered guilty. In the 90s, Paul decided to report him and take him to court. However, Larry King never showed up.
And a federal investigation showed he'd stolen $40 million, but the money trail quickly led to the original allegations of child abuse.
They didn't ask me very much about Larry King. They treated the allegations I made about the people who abused me almost like a joke.
It was evident that Paul had experienced multiple traumas. He had been in pretty bad shape and had been linked to all these things that he really didn't want to be a part of. So the judge supposedly awarded him a compensation of $1 million that he never actually received. The Franklin Circle was officially dismantled around 2012 to 2013. They were at least able to dismantle a part of it. It's not known if everything is completely dismantled, but at least they were able to rescue 100 children who were being abused and sold. And honestly, I think the family's fight for Johnny had a lot to do with these things. Because it opened a dialogue that was completely closed before, it was hidden from the public eye. Now, regarding what I mentioned to you before, there's one last theory, and it's that they say Johnny could have been part of Project Monarch. And that someone might have changed his mind, changed his memory to turn him into Jeff Gannon, a person who is linked to prostitution and who appeared almost out of nowhere in politics. He was at the White House many times and no one could explain why. I know he had connections with the president or with someone in a high position, and it wasn't very clear what was going on. His whole persona was suspicious, and really nothing is known about his past. Several times they asked him if he could take DNA tests to put an end to the theories that he was Johnny, and every time he answered that yes, he was going to do it, but he never did. We don't have a birth certificate either, but he claims that he's older than Johnny. Most people base this not only on his past, but also on his face. Few photos of him exist, but comparing his face to Johnny's reveals some similar features, though not identical. Honestly, I don't see all the resemblance that people attribute to him, but there are people who say it could be. Also, the person in general is very suspicious, but that doesn't mean it's Johnny. However, that's where the theory comes in that maybe under Project Monarch, he suffered a memory change. I'm not going to go too deep into this theory because honestly, I don't find much basis for it. But can you investigate it yourselves? You have the person and the name. Search on the internet and dive into that huge rabbit hole of questions that are in the forums. I think there must be a ton of things about this theory on Reddit, so you'll have plenty to look at. Let's talk about the present. The mother went on her way, kept searching for answers, and after she found her son, she let him go. She kept helping other families who were going through the same situation and explaining to them what usually happens in these cases. At the same time, she has been teaching yoga for more than 40 years, and in 1993 she separated from her husband, although according to VI they respect each other. Her husband seems to greatly admire her. But, well, as we've seen in other cases, it's not easy at all to cope with a loss like this. It's not easy at all. For his part, Paul got married, lives as happily as he can, and continues to be a great source when it comes to these kinds of topics. He keeps talking about all of this, so it won't be forgotten. Also, if you want to know a little more about all these things, you can also check out the testimony of Jimmy Gibson and Rustin Nelson. They are people who also came out with Paul to talk about this subject and to speak about trafficking in a personal way, because they experienced it themselves. As for Johnny, I think what his mother says is true, and precisely because I know of other cases, I can say this with almost total certainty. Because when people get involved in trafficking, when there are people who are unfortunately kidnapped and fall into this, they are usually pursued for the rest of their lives. There are many people who get out. And even if you know they got out of there, you should never say their names. You should never use their real name. They don't even use it themselves, and besides, they live in fear all the time because many times there are people who get out and are found again. We could say that there are cases where the police don't find things or take a long time. Well, no, those involved in trafficking make the whole investigation seem that way. It's absurd. They pursue escapees and force their return, condemning them to a lifetime of fleeing from this ordeal. Can you film? Can't you record? You basically can't contact them using their real name, not even a little because they're in danger, simply because of that. There are many cases like that. I never mentioned any on the channel of people who survived trafficking, but there are several, and the stories they tell are terrible. If you want to know more information about all of this, you can start, if you want, with Johnny Gosch's website, which is hisname.com, that is johnnygosch.com. And there you'll see, besides the theories and the story, a section for downloads. There, you can download the file I mentioned at the beginning and in the middle of the video, which is 92 pages long, explaining Noreen's story, personally or directly. I'm going to leave the link to that portable document format below in the description so you can check it out if you want. It's very interesting. With nothing more to add, this concludes the case. If you have another theory or something to contribute, please leave it in the comments as I read them. But anyway, moving away from the case now, let's put it aside and relax. My Patreon supporters are listed here. Check the link below to learn more. Thanks for your support. And what I did recently was add a new tier. A new reward doesn't merely include the previous ones, but rather offers something fresh, which would be being able to watch the videos before they come out on YouTube, but they also get early scripts, which I will be uploading depending on the demand, I suppose. You can provide the script you'd like me to upload, as many people need to see more details that way. Or do you like to read that kind of thing? And honestly, I think it's interesting to be able to read it too. Also, those scripts have quite a few sources because I usually leave the most important ones there. I usually leave the links to the pages I visit and so on there. And I guess it's also useful for someone who doesn't really understand, for example, my Spanish, Latin American, Argentine, and wants to read everything calmly and at their own pace. So well, it's there on Patreon. On the other hand, you have a new video, you have a recommended video, you can subscribe by clicking on my face, and I'll see you in another video. Goodbye.